we can get started on the presentation. So welcome to the Johns Hopkins SAIS ISEP webinar series. It's very nice to see all of you in the audience, and I'm of course particularly delighted to have Professor Patrick Beyer presenting for us, with whom we've been working on these topics extensively for a very long time. Now, the way we are going to do this is that Dr. Beyer is going to give us his presentation. And in the meantime, I would request everybody to mute your microphones so that we can avoid any echo and any issues. If you have questions that come up during the presentation, the easiest thing to do is to type them in the chat function and address them to everybody. So that way we'll have a list of all the questions once Patrick's presentation is over, and we can just start tackling them one at a time. And then, of course, you are free to add any more questions at that time. We've found it easier to use the chat window than to have interaction, given that we have already 16 people on the line. So, Patrick, please, floor is all yours. Patrick, I think you're on mute at this time.
There you go. I hope it's working now. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And also, everyone can see the presentation slides?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Excellent. So the technical difficulties with webinars are successfully navigated. Okay, so let me try this again. Johannes, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here today to deliver this ISEP webinar. Again, obviously, as we hear in the news, kind of with the climate emergency, but probably also with global health challenges we seem to be facing. I think these new technologies about delivering information and knowledge will become more and more important and pertinent. And so I think, again, it's great that ISEP is leading the way here and trying to disseminate the work we do in this fashion. I'm also very pleased to see that many people joined in. What I'd like to do today is really just to give everyone an overview of basically a couple of projects that many people from ISEP, including Johannes, Brian, and Jan, have been working on for the last couple of years. And the topic, as you can take from the slides, will be around impact evaluation in the context of electricity access research. Just to foreshadow things a little bit, what we're going to mainly focus on is the importance of the geographic distribution of where the studies take place, that we are where the impact assessment take place, and then we'll also be looking at what is variation across the different imperial strategies that are used in this type of research. Again, kind of, I think one of those challenges with webinars, obviously, is that you all have a comparative advantage, and there's quite some asymmetric information in terms that you all can see me, but I can't see any of you guys. So as Johannes said, if you have questions, please type them up for later on. Yeah, I think it's a very exciting topic, so I hope not too many of you are going to fall asleep. There's certainly very interesting stuff going on in that domain. So in order to get us started, what I'd like to do is really also to acknowledge the fact that I'm not really sure what people know about electricity access, about energy access problems in general. So before we talk about the research that we have been doing and talk about the policy implications that follow from that, I really like to set the stage a little bit. And I'd like to do that by looking at both the quality of the problem when we talk about electricity access, but also looking about it in terms of the scale that lies ahead of us. So you'll get some overview of where we stand. So when we talk about energy access in the research literature, then basically usually people talk about access in terms of access to electricity, but also access to cooking. And the important bit here is that this presentation is solely focused on the electricity side of things, just in terms of definitions. When we talk about access here, it's really access to electricity rather than cooking. Obviously, just self-advertisement here, if you're interested in the broader picture of energy access and escaping the energy poverty trap, then obviously there's a book we've published with MIT Press in 2018 which might be a worthwhile read for this audience here. So what's going on? What are we talking about when we talk about electricity access, and then why do we care about that? And again, kind of for people working in this domain, that might seem straightforward. For newcomers to the domain, kind of it is a very legitimate question. And the issue with electricity access, or the promises that are made that it can solve, are along various dimensions, right? So there are claims being made that electricity, or access to electricity, obviously underlies economic growth. And that can probably come through all of a sudden being able to use mechanization in agriculture, to use electric water pumps, and kind of obviously start to produce on larger scale using electricity, powering your facilities, your manufacturing infrastructure, and so forth and so forth. So that's probably a very straightforward way to think about how electricity can have positive impacts. But obviously there are also other important benefits from electricity access as well, which relate to health issues around refrigeration, the use of air conditioning, so forth. There are a couple of studies that look into the possibility of access to electricity, access to lighting, which can have on study time, educational outcomes, and so forth. Obviously, you can power radios, TV sets, and so forth, so some leisure components, but there's also issues around public safety. So kind of those examples are just a way to say that a lot of the development literature, when they talk about providing access to electricity, claim that there is a whole host of benefits that can result for the development of local communities. Now, obviously, the bigger picture in terms of the political landscape around electricity access has to do with the fact that in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals were provided by the UN, and kind of one of those goals, in particular SDG 7, revolves all around access to electricity, access to energy in more general terms. Again, why is that important? I think it's important to realize that, if I'm not mistaken, that was for the first time that the importance of electricity and energy was recognized at such a high level. And there was also the pledge made to ensure access to modern energy for everyone by 2030. So that, again, gives us a little bit of context in terms of where we're heading with this. Now, in order to contextualize things a little bit further, and to give you a sense, especially of the scale of the problem and the geography of the problem in a way, this is a map from that shows electricity access in 2018 from the IEA. And again, if you look at this, then the lighter yellow colored numbers are basically good news in terms of fairly high electrification rates. The darker the colors get, the worse the electrification access is. And obviously what we see is that there is a huge electrification challenge that still remains in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'd like you to take a good look at that map, because we'll come back to a similar map later on, and then it's worthwhile to remember kind of where the electrification challenges are the most prevalent ones. Now, in terms of more general recent trends, again, the good news first in a way is that as of 2018, there are 860 million people, so about 1 in 10 around the world, which still lack access to electricity. Why is that good news? Well, it's good news that this is at least the lowest number we have seen so far. Why is it bad news? It's bad news because ultimately, kind of thinking back to the SDG 7 goal, right? In order to meet that goal, it means that in the next 10 years, we would have to electrify all those remaining roughly 900 million that are still sitting in the dark, quite literally, right? Also, again, kind of just squaring this up with the geographical distribution that we've seen before, in the progress that we've seen over the last decade is very uneven. And it's such that most of the progress have been made in Asia. So over the last decade, we have seen 800 million people being electrified, 80% of which of this electrification effort happened in Asia. And so with this in mind, we have seen an electrification rate in Asia that sits at about 94%, but still the big challenge, as we've seen on the map before, is still that about 600 million remain unelectrified in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, there are some positive developments, kind of both in the grid and off-grid space, and this is mostly led by Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, amongst others, where we have seen strong electrification efforts, as I said, both in terms of grid. So, for instance, in Kenya, from 2013 to 2018, the electrification rate has increased from 25% to about 75%. And we've also seen a lot more solar home systems. The number of solar home systems in the last 2-3 years doubled in sub-Saharan Africa, which also is positive news if we talk about electricity access, obviously. Now, the sobering news is that electrification rate still remains fairly low. And one of the major challenges in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, that the IEA points out, is obviously one of population growth. So right now, each year.
May I interrupt? I think some of the audience is having a little bit of difficulty. If you can try to speak a bit closer to the mic and maybe just enunciate and go a little slower, that might help.
Okay, excellent. Sorry for that, guys. Apologies. Let me see. Is it any better now?
I think right now it's good. There might be also a bit of a connection issue, but of course nothing we can do about it. Just try to keep it slow and as clear as possible.
Okay, good. So again, one of those lessons for webinars, maybe a mic closer to your mouth is more useful than relying on the laptop's mic. Apologies for that. I hope that it's going to improve, but please do let me know if no. Okay, so where have we been? Well, we kind of stopped more or less at where, so one of the challenges the IEA outlines in its stated policy scenario is that there's a huge challenge in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular around population growth, which has to do with the fact that about 20 million new connections are made in Africa these days. But in order to meet the sustainable development goal, their simulations suggest we need to triple that to about 60 million. So again, this is really just for context, and you can read a lot of that in the IEA report. But I hope that it helps to contextualize a lot of the kind of new research that we tested. An important point to realize, which obviously people always worry about, is the fact that when I talk about electricity access, then this really refers to access in the kind of in a very binary way. So either you're connected and have access to the grid, or you don't have access to the grid, which for one does not mean that the connections you have are reliable in terms of supply. And it also means that the supply might not be affordable. Right, so kind of there's a big kind of qualitative jump to be made from having a connection to having a reliable and affordable connection. And again, I think that's just something that we want to keep in mind when we think about the electrification challenge that we face. Okay, so what's the motivation that comes out of this that brought us into looking into the topic of electrification and rural electrification more systematically? Well, what I guess we can take away from this overall message is that electricity access remains a massive problem, with still about 900 million people being unelectrified. And then obviously on the other end of the spectrum, if you want, the Sustainable Development Goals articulate this need to address this problem and try to close the gap between the number of people who remain being electrified. An implication of this is, in order to achieve this goal, enormous financing is required. And obviously, if the investment needs are in the order of the billions, then obviously the one big question we want to answer ourselves, want to ask ourselves is where do we put this money? How do we allocate this money? And in the space of rural electrification, I think there are two immediate follow-up questions that we would like to think about. The one is, obviously this is focused on, this presentation is focused on electricity access, but obviously if we think about the realities in least developed countries, then it's by no means straightforward that big investments should be made in electricity access over education, over other infrastructure projects, over sanitation projects and so forth, right? So I think that's just a different way to say there are some trade-offs to be made, and there's certainly an opportunity cost from investing in electricity access, which implies that if we want to justify those big investments, we probably need to understand what are the impacts, what are the returns for society, if you want, from making those grid connections, right? And that kind of, hopefully you see the connection there, but that ultimately for us was the motivation, trying to look into, well, once electricity access is made, what are the impacts that result from this, and how can we measure them? How do they vary over geography? And this is what we'll come to in a second. So that, I think that's certainly one question we want to think about, and obviously other people before us have made those claims that there's this opportunity cost from rural electrification. The other issue is around issues on which of the interventions work, right? So obviously different countries are trialing different electrification efforts. There's lots of variation in the policies that countries use. You can go for grid connection, you can try decentralized off-grid connections. There's variation in technologies, there's variation in pricing opportunities that come with those connections. There's issues in terms of how much maintenance the various systems might need. And obviously, if you're a country and you're faced with trying to improve rural electrification, try to make more connections, then obviously you want to know which are the interventions that have been working in the past, right? And I think there again, kind of that led us to think about, well, kind of, can we say something systematic about the impacts that result from rural electrification studies that we've seen being done in the past. So again, that is just the basic motivation of why we care about this, and why we want to understand the impacts from electricity access. So just to foreshadow the results a bit, there are three main findings that come out of the papers that we've written over the last 2 years or so. The one, kind of some sobering news, but yeah, very surprising news to us as well, was that we know fairly little about what those impacts from electricity access are. And I'll elaborate on that in a second. But again, I think that's an important first takeaway message to know about. The second important message is that there's high levels of geographic concentration of where those existing impact assessments are done. And we'll talk about that in a second in greater depth. But obviously, if there's huge geographic concentration, then it's not straightforward that what holds from an impact assessment, say in some Indian state, does automatically travel to Sub-Saharan Africa, right? And obviously the issues there are around, if we want to learn from successful policies in other areas, we really need to understand a lot of the context that comes with the specific studies that we have been looking at. And then the final point that we want to focus in on is the fact that impact studies are very sensitive to the empirical strategy. So the specific chosen method in terms of whether it is an experiment or whether it is an observational study, that might matter in terms of what impacts we find. And again, this is I think important news that has not necessarily been addressed before in this explicit way that we did. Okay, so what did we do? As I said, the original motivation was trying to understand the impacts from rural electrification or electrification access. So what we've done is we've done what's called a systematic review of the existing literature. So essentially we started out to look into existing papers and then try to get a sense of, okay, to begin with, how many papers do exist that do rigorous impact assessment, and what are the findings that they present. Now, the first thing what I want to highlight here is that this systematic review is really more an algorithmic procedure rather than kind of more familiar literature reviews, which some people might say are a bit more subjective in terms of you cite the studies you know, but there might still be a lot of work out there that you might miss just for the sake of socialization, sake of what you know about a given topic. So the systematic review tries to take a slightly different approach. And what we've done is we essentially used literature databases such as Google Scholars, Science Direct, Web of Science, and others, and essentially searched for papers that were in the rural electrification space, right? So we had some specific strings, which words around rural electrification, words around impact, benefits, and so forth. And that more or less gave us a universe of papers that was studied on the topic. So the initial universe that we've looked at are about 7,200 studies, all of which were published post-2000. Now, obviously, not all of those studies are the ones that assess impacts in the way that we care about. So what happens usually in those systematic reviews is that you need to define some filters that allow you to filter down to the studies that you really care about. And what happens as part of this filtering process is obviously that the sample that you're looking at is going to decrease. But obviously you will be in a better position to then use those papers to answer the question that you're after. And I'll just walk you through the filtering process. Again, the one important reason why we use the systematic review is that obviously it is a very transparent and kind of replicable process, which we found is something that's desirable. And again, if you have specific questions on this, then please do let me know about this. So the first filter we applied is basically based on the title on the abstract. We just checked whether out of those 7,200 papers, whether they really talk about impact or whether they look about related aspects to rural electrification. And that kind of already dramatically reduced the number of studies to about 500. And then we went through those 500 studies based on reading the full articles in order to make sure that the studies are really focused on trying to assess the impacts from rural electrification and are not talking about related engineering aspects or kind of policy governance aspects or some other aspects related to rural electrification. So that brought the number down to about 283 studies, and then kind of we go further from that. Amongst those, there are a couple which are purely descriptive, and they just describe specific procedures put in place to assess impacts, but they don't really assess or test the impacts themselves. And then again, removing this type of study leaves us with about 100 studies, and you kind of see where we're converging towards. But ultimately, kind of amongst those studies that kind of tried to test impacts, we also excluded the ones which were qualitative in nature. And again, that was just for the reason that we wanted to get a quantifiable sense of how big are the effects, the measurable effects of rural impact electrification, really in terms of added hours of lighting or kind of reductions in household spending or some of those outcome measures. And then ultimately, we, for our purposes, focus on household level impacts. So again, that's an important caveat, because in the literature you'll see other studies that assess firm level impacts, regional impacts, and so forth. For our purposes, we are really mainly concerned of once people get access to electricity, what changes happen at the household level in terms of household incomes, in terms of household savings, and so forth. And then kind of related to that, for the remainder of the talk, we focus on 5 particular outcome variables, which we identified as some of the most interesting ones, but also some of those where we would find a lot of other studies that looked at similar outcomes. And those outcomes in particular, if you're interested in that, was essentially what do households spend on energy, what is household income, household savings, whether educational attainment changes, and then ultimately whether upon electrification, households start to create businesses. So kind of in that, once we've done that, we were left with a case with a data set of about 15 studies. We then went through all those 15 studies systematically again to combine this top-down search with a bottom-up search, and that left us with about 31 studies that one is rigorously test impact evaluations, the impacts from rural electrification. And this is more or less what underpins one of the first conclusions that I've shown before, which we found really surprising and truly shocking, which is namely the fact that there were only 31 studies that very systematically tried to assess the impacts from rural electrification. Now, there is some good news to it in the sense that many of those studies have been done in the last 3 to 5 years. So there's certainly a growth in studies that are published on the topic, but still, obviously, it is a very, very tiny number. Okay, so what we've done then, and this is kind of where the map from the beginning comes back. Once we had identified those 31 studies, we wanted to know in what countries are those studies conducted. So a different way to say that is basically, what are the countries from which we know something about impacts from electrification measures. And this graph gives you a little bit of a breakdown. So out of the 31 studies, they looked at 16 different countries, and 10 countries of those, namely the ones that you can see in the bar plot on this slide, all of these 10 countries only had a single study being carried out. So kind of what that ultimately means, there are only 6 countries for which we have at least 2 studies or more. You can see that India leads the pack in a sense with 8 studies overall. But obviously, this is kind of one interesting measure to think about, and I'll show you a visualization kind of geographically in a second. What obviously we need to keep in mind is that those countries do also dramatically vary in terms of the amount of people that are still unelectrified. And this is what you see kind of indicated with those little yellow triangles over here, that even though India has 8 studies, like again, kind of given the size of India and given the electrification challenge that they face, despite massive progress in recent years, as a tiny fraction when you standardize by the sheer amount of people who still lack access. Okay. Another important information to be mindful of here is obviously that countries such as Ethiopia or the Democratic Republic of Congo, they don't even feature here, right? Even though they have huge populations that still lack access to electricity. And now again, if we try to visualize this geographically, and this is, I think, where the link can be made to the other map from the IEA that I made earlier. Essentially, the bottom line, this picture looks almost like a mirror image of the picture that we've seen before, right? So essentially, especially in this area in the sub-Saharan African context, there are very few studies that have been done, even though the electrification challenge is tremendous there, right? Obviously, we could say that does not necessarily have to be a big problem. It wouldn't have to be a problem if we were super confident that, let's say, the insights we get from rural electrification studies from India travel to the African context, right? But obviously, this is very far far-stretched example, and there is robust research showing that the impacts in sub-Saharan Africa seem to be much smaller from rural electrification, and I'll come back to that in a second. But again, just to put this in context, if we think about the possibility of learning from successful policies in other countries, right, then the mistake we shouldn't be making as policymakers is we shouldn't be made to believe that just because a specific study, a specific policy intervention that brings about rural electrification in one country will result in similar effects in another country, right? And again, that might be something that's obvious, but certainly a lot of the scope conditions, a lot of the conditions around social context, cultural context, political context, economic context, they all have some effect on what impacts we're going to see. And that, I think, makes it immensely problematic that we see very, very few impact evaluation studies being done in sub-Saharan Africa, when this is where about 2/3 of the currently unelectrified people in the world are living. Right? Now, to make things, so, and kind of just to back up the claim that I've made earlier, it is not only the fact that we do observe fewer studies in sub-Saharan Africa, but it is also the case that we see different impacts in different regions. And again, so for this, what we did do is we coded the impacts that were measured in the studies we had identified. So out of the 31 studies, we looked at what are the outcomes that are measured. So changes in, as I said earlier, changes in household incomes, changes in household savings. And then we coded all of those individual outcomes in terms of whether they had a positive impact, in terms of increasing household income, increasing household savings, and so forth. Whether they had a neutral income in terms of there were really any changes detected in the study, or whether those impacts were negative. And so again, when we, the way we designed or the way we built our coding scheme was we built it around statistical significance and not about the size of the coefficient. Again, some people might jump at me for that, and we know that it is somewhat problematic. But obviously, what we try to achieve here is to make the coding scheme as robust and as replicable as possible. So whenever I talk about impacts and whenever I talk about positive or neutral impacts in what follows, then positive means there was a positive change which was also statistically significant. Now, this obviously can mean that substantively this change is very small or very large, but it can very well happen that you have a change in the use of lighting, lighting for, I don't know, 15 minutes, which obviously is an increase, but it's not an increase of 2 or 3 hours or something, right? So kind of what we need to bear in mind when we talk about positive impacts is that this is really a positive change that turns out to be statistically significant, independent of whether we think the change is really substantively a big or a small one. And we can, again, come back to that and discuss later. Similarly, obviously, if you look at a lot of those studies, you will realize that there are different econometric specifications in a lot of those papers, and what we usually did is we focused on the main specification of the original conclusion of the paper. We also tried, and again, this is for all the researchers following the webinar, we also tried to standardize the effect sizes of those coefficients, which proved immensely difficult for 2 reasons. The one was that there was a huge variation in terms of measures. So if we talk about positive changes from electrification for education, then some people measure it about school attendance rates, other measure it about attainment, other measure it about test scores, and various different ways of how to measure outcomes that fall under the same kind of category. And then the other problem what we found is that there were really a lot of papers where the descriptive statistics that we would have needed to meaningfully standardize the effect sizes were simply lacking. So with that, with these caveats in mind, what do we find? Well, we find evidence that's consistent with evidence from previous and other studies, is that out of all the impacts we assess, and this is what you see down here, about 3 out of 4 have positive impacts. If you look across the regions, then you see what kind of stands out is that impacts in sub-Saharan Africa are deflated. And again, there is other existing research which suggests that because of high electrification costs and low income levels in Africa, it might be difficult for communities to capitalize on a lot of these impacts that are generated, that could be generated in theory from access to electricity. And then kind of the other interesting implication to look at, and that again speaks particularly if we're interested in learning from different regions, is how representative are those countries that we have studies on. And again, this is just a really preliminary analysis from the paper that I've been talking about. But while we see that for those countries in our sample, those countries are fairly comparable to a lot of the other developing economies when we look at GDP. But what we see on this plot here on the right is that, at least in terms of population density, the countries that end up in the sample which we study are much more densely populated, right? Which obviously, for looking at electrification impacts, is immensely important, because we know that more densely populated countries are easier to electrify to begin with. So again, kind of, if we want to learn from essentially this blue distribution about the gray distribution, right, then kind of one of the impediments that we might have is that those countries in which we see positive impacts occurring, these positive impacts might not easily travel to substantively different contexts in other countries, right? It might even get worse than that, in the sense that for now we only talked about variation across countries, but obviously we can also think about variation within countries. And we looked at some of this for the countries for which we had several studies. And one important takeaway message here is that in countries as big as India, for instance, even regional variation and variation within the country can be very challenging in terms of trying to make inferences about policy which works in the north might not work in the south, right? And in fact, there's a kind of nice recent paper by Lee et al. Which kind of makes this very nice point that even in neighboring communities, you might get very different assessments of those impacts because of different willingness to pay for electricity access. So it might actually be that we have a kind of much more variation in how people value access to electricity, and that might very well be a function of what they can do with those with access to electricity. And the Lee et al. Paper makes this nice point that probably, if in order to capitalize more on the impacts that we want to see from electricity access, we need to think more systematically about complementary policies that come with rural electrification. So rural electrification in and of itself might not be enough to capitalize on the positive impacts from rural electrification. And again, that's probably something to think about, and we can come back to that in the Q&A. Okay, so in a sense, that was the first part of the research that we've done, which tried to look at geographical clustering of impact assessments. The second study we conducted was trying to look at another dimension along which some of those studies vary, and that is the specific research methodology or research method that's used in those studies. And again, that's a point that's made in the very same Lee et al. Paper, which kind of also emphasizes that there might be those differences in method which could drive, and we claim that it does, how much positive impacts we see. So what did we do here? Well, kind of the interesting bit about variation in methods is that different methods, so different ways of how to assess the success of impact evaluations of rural electrification is how well suited they are for causal inference. And here the kind of gold standard, if you want, is that a lot of research that uses experimental methods allows you to randomize the assignment of electrification, and that more or less averages over a lot of other otherwise confounding differences in groups. So the experimental approach to evaluating impacts is probably the best one to assess causal effects between policies and outcomes. But obviously implementing randomized control experiments or implementing experimental studies is also not always straightforward. And so there's a mix of different methods that have been used to assess impacts from rural electrification. And we distinguish 4 different categories. We have descriptive methods, we have studies that use instrumental variables, different approaches, and ultimately experimental methods. For most of the results that I'm going to show you in a second is we group these 3 different methods into what we call observational studies, and we complement that with results from experimental studies. Now, what we were interested in to get a sense of is whether those impacts that are found depend on the specific method that's used. The obvious challenge for this is that the use of method is also correlated with the type of technology that is used for those impact assessments. So what that means is that a lot of what we see, kind of the divide we find in the data, probably unsurprisingly, is that the experimental studies are much more focused on off-grid applications compared to the observational studies. And obviously the inferential challenge then is how can we tell apart whether the differences in methods we see are indeed differences in methods or whether they are differences in the underlying technologies that are used in the rural electrification policies. And kind of just to foreshadow things a little bit here, because we have a very small sample, we cannot really come to an ultimately definitive solution, but at least the pattern that I'm going to show you in a second is something that's very robust across various ways to slice and dice the data. So what do we find? When we look at, again, the differences in impacts, and again, this is the same impact coding that we've used for the other study. So there are some impact studies that find negative results from rural electrification, most of them find neutral ones, and then there's a big chunk of studies that find positive ones. And if we break this down by observational methods and experimental methods, what we see is that the share of positive outcomes is much, much higher in observational studies compared to experimental ones. And again, because we believe that experimental studies are the ones which are kind of advantageous when it comes to trying to make a causal link between policy and outcomes, this is probably something that's very problematic for policymakers, because it might actually be that if a lot of the interventions are based on observational impact assessments, then you might actually be over-promising some of the benefits that rural electrification might bring. And again, kind of the same picture broken down by numbers. What you see here is that the experimental studies, they have a much lower share of positive impacts recorded relative to all of the observational methods. Okay, so kind of there are, as I said, a couple of alternative explanations for those patterns. The one could be around grid versus off-grid technologies, or in exactly the sense that I've been saying. A lot of the experimental methods focus on off-grid technologies, but we do find an almost similar pattern and similar breakdown in terms of shares if we split our results by grid and off-grid technology. There are some issues probably around some of the outcomes might be more ambitious, or some of the outcomes are at least kind of more immediate. So again, the logic here is that if we get an electricity connection or if we get access to lighting, then study times could increase immediately. But for instance, the time it takes for local communities to set up businesses might take much longer. So again, there is this this difference in terms of how ambitious or how immediate outcomes can be realized. And again, if that is correlated with method, then that could possibly confound the finding that we have. Again, the good news is, and the details are in the paper, but the good news is that the breakdown of the numbers that we've seen before is similar. And the same goes if we split our if we split our data by looking at African versus non-African impact assessments being done in African countries versus non-African countries. So in a sense, as I said, we cannot make any causal claims here, obviously, but at least the main takeaway message from this is that we have found in kind of various ways of looking at the data that experimental studies seem to be producing fewer positive impacts, which again might be something that's very important to keep in mind when trying to design those policies and when trying to kind of give recommendations of what we should expect from how much positive impacts we can anticipate from these policies. Yeah, and this is kind of, as I said, the caveat that comes with this is that we want to frame it as indicative evidence because the sample size obviously is based on the 31 studies that we have been identifying. So any type of statistical tests here are more or less tedious. Okay, so in order to wrap this up, what does that mean in terms of policy implications? The one implication to take from this, and that's simply based on the fact that we found very few studies, is that more rigorous impact assessments are needed. And the important bit to remember here is really that we need to more systematically diversify the geographic scope. So that means that when we design those impact assessments, we probably want to look at whether the countries that we plan to study, how underrepresented those are, and we want to have more of these impact assessments, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's not imminently clear that the results we find in other areas in other regions around the world do easily travel to there. And kind of in the context of the electrification challenge there is the biggest, we need to be wary of that. The other point, which I think I've already made in passing, but is really just one to remember, that a lot of those local economic, social, political, and cultural conditions really matter for how these impacts materialize. And I think the literature and the research is still in infancy when it comes to trying to understand how many of those factors condition the impacts that we see. And those impacts or those scope conditions can amplify or they can weaken the impacts, and we have still fairly poor understanding of this. So kind of in going forward, a lot of the research, if I was allowed to make a wish, should really theorize and also explain better the scope conditions under which their studies take place. And then ultimately, I think there's more collaboration between researchers and policymakers that's needed. And that's probably for two reasons. The one is we want to assess the modes of electrification that are prioritized by governments. So we want to tackle those questions, which are the most imminent and most policy relevant questions. And I think the other need for more collaboration is simply driven by this fact that the implementation or the deployment of those rural electrification policies and the assessment should be something that needs to be planned together. And this is particularly the case if we think about randomized controlled trials or experimental studies. We need to think about these things kind of before we implement those policies. So I think more collaboration on that and is certainly something that's desirable in order particularly to also use experimental studies to assess grid technologies, which is something that happens fairly infrequently still. Okay, so I think with that, I'll just wrap it up and then look forward to questions and comments.
Excellent. Thank you, Patrick. We still have a few minutes left, so if people have any questions or comments, please input them into the chat window and we will respond as they come. So right now it looks like we don't actually have any questions. Is there anybody in the audience who would like to ask any questions? Okay, I guess it seems like, Patrick, your presentation was comprehensive enough that you covered all the imaginable questions. So that's quite okay. So thanks, Patrick, for joining us and giving a comprehensive review. We are going to post this webinar on the SAIS events page as soon as it's ready, and at that time we will promote this presentation on social media and through other channels, so more people can get access to the presentation.
Okay, well, excellent, brilliant. Thank you so much for having me, Johannes.
Thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.